Isolation. Of every technique ever used to reshape the way a person thinks, removing them from their existing relationships has consistently proven to be the most effective starting point. When someone is cut off from friends, family, and any outside perspective, their entire frame of reference begins to collapse. They lose access to the people who would ordinarily challenge new ideas, offer alternative views, or simply remind them of who they were before. Cults have used this for decades, moving new members into communal living arrangements where outside contact is restricted or monitored. Authoritarian governments have used it in detention facilities. Even abusive relationships rely on a quieter version of it, gradually reducing a person's social circle until the abuser becomes the only consistent voice in their life. Isolation does not change what a person believes immediately. What it does is remove every competing source of information, which makes everything that follows far easier. Sleep deprivation. The human brain begins to deteriorate in measurable ways after roughly 20 hours without sleep. Judgment weakens. The ability to evaluate whether something is logical or contradictory starts to break down. Emotional regulation collapses, making a person significantly more susceptible to fear, guilt, and sudden feelings of warmth or relief, depending on what they are being told. Interrogators have known this for a long time, and not only in extreme settings. Many high-control religious groups schedule new members into overnight prayer sessions, study marathons, and multi-day retreats with minimal rest, not necessarily with conscious intent to break someone down, but because the environments they create reliably produce that outcome. A sleep-deprived person is not stupid. They are chemically impaired in ways that make resistance genuinely difficult, and the beliefs absorbed during that state can persist long after normal sleep resumes. Thought-terminating clichés. Robert J. Lifton, who studied thought reform in Chinese political prisons in the 1950s, identified this technique as one of the defining features of ideological control systems. The idea is straightforward. Every high-control environment, whether a cult, an authoritarian state, a corporation with a suffocating internal culture, or a manipulative relationship, develops a set of short phrases that are used to shut down internal questioning the moment it begins. In religious movements, these might sound like, "That's just your ego talking," or "Doubt is the enemy of faith." In political contexts, they become slogans repeated often enough that they replace analysis entirely. The phrases do not answer questions. They make the act of questioning feel like a personal failure or a sign of weak commitment. Over time, a person internalizes these phrases and begins applying them to themselves automatically, which means the group no longer needs to silence doubt from the outside because the person has learned to do it from within. Love bombing. It begins not with pressure or fear, but with an overwhelming flood of warmth, attention, and belonging. A new recruit, a new romantic partner, or a new employee is made to feel more seen and valued than they have ever felt in their life. Compliments arrive constantly. Time and energy are devoted to them in ways that feel extraordinary. The group or individual doing this is rarely calculating it consciously. In many cases, the warmth is real, at least at first. What makes love bombing effective as a conditioning tool is that it creates a powerful emotional debt. The person receiving it begins to associate the group or the relationship with safety, worth, and joy. Later, when the environment shifts and demands begin to appear, the memory of that initial warmth becomes a reason to stay, to comply, to assume the fault must lie within themselves. It is the opening credit line on an emotional account that will eventually be used against them. Confession and self-criticism. This technique was refined to a systematic art in Maoist China, but versions of it appear in almost every high-control environment ever documented. Members are required to confess doubts, failures, personal sins, or politically incorrect thoughts, either privately to a leader or publicly before the group. At first, this can feel cathartic. There is genuine psychological relief in acknowledged guilt, but the ongoing practice of confession
creates several lasting effects. It generates detailed personal information that can be used later to apply targeted pressure. It reinforces the idea that the self is fundamentally flawed and in need of constant correction by the group. And it builds a kind of internal surveillance mechanism. The person begins monitoring their own thoughts for material that would need to be confessed, which means they begin policing their own mind on the group's behalf without anyone needing to watch them at all. Milieu control. This refers to the management of an entire social environment rather than the manipulation of an individual mind. When someone lives, works, eats, sleeps, socializes, and learns exclusively within a space controlled by one group or ideology, every input they receive has been filtered. There is no neutral conversation, no overheard opinion that hasn't passed through the same framework, no relationship that exists outside the group's influence. The most complete modern examples are found in residential cults, certain political education systems, and some military indoctrination programs. But softer versions exist in closed online communities where algorithms and moderation practices create an environment in which every piece of content reinforces the same worldview and dissenting voices are rapidly removed. Milieu control is particularly durable because the person inside it is not receiving instructions in the traditional sense. They are simply living in a world where everything they encounter confirms what they have been told to believe.
The fear then relief cycle. This operates on a principle that interrogators, cult architects, and abusers have all discovered independently. The mind bonds most powerfully to whatever relieves its fear. An environment is first made threatening through uncertainty, punishment, public humiliation, or simply the withdrawal of the warmth that love bombing established. Then, relief is offered, but only in the form of compliance, confession, or renewed commitment to the group. The relief feels profound because the fear was real. The person experiences something close to gratitude toward the very source of the original threat. Clinical psychology identifies this as a form of trauma bonding, and it explains why people in demonstrably harmful relationships or groups so often describe a genuine and confusing sense of attachment to the people or institutions causing them harm. The cycle does not need to be extreme to be effective. Small-scale versions, a supervisor who creates anxiety and then offers approval, a partner who withdraws and then reconnects, produce the same neurological imprint over time.
Loaded language. Every closed system of belief develops its own vocabulary, and that vocabulary is rarely accidental. Words are assigned new or narrowed meanings that only make sense inside the group. Outsiders are given specific labels. Internal experiences are given names that frame them in ways that serve the group's worldview. Members of the Jehovah's Witnesses refer to leaving the faith as apostasy, a word that carries centuries of moral weight, suggesting betrayal and corruption. Scientology uses a dense internal vocabulary that took years for journalists and former members to decode and explain to the public. Political movements develop their own sets of terms that signal membership and frame opponents in ways that make nuanced engagement impossible. The function of loaded language is not just to communicate within the group, it is to create a cognitive environment where certain thoughts become literally unthinkable because the words needed to think them do not exist inside the shared vocabulary. Repetition. There is nothing subtle about this one, and its lack of subtlety does not reduce its effectiveness. A statement repeated often enough begins to feel familiar, and familiarity is processed by the brain as a form of truth. Psychologists call this the illusory truth effect. In controlled studies, participants consistently rate statements as more likely to be accurate after they have been exposed to them multiple times, even when they were told at the start that some of the statements were false. Propaganda systems have relied on this since long before the science was formalized. The political slogan, the daily prayer, the required recitation of ideological principles, the news broadcast that returns to the same framing repeatedly throughout the day, all of these function on the same mechanism. Repetition does not convince through argument.
It convinces through saturation, by making an idea feel like something the person already knew rather than something they were told. Us versus them framing. Humans are social animals with a deeply wired tendency to form in groups and view out groups with suspicion. Every effective brainwashing system exploits this. Members are told in explicit or implicit terms that the world outside the group is dangerous, corrupt, spiritually lost, politically captured, or simply incapable of understanding the truth that members now possess. This framing does two things simultaneously. It makes leaving feel like a descent into something worse rather than an escape from something harmful. And it makes outside criticism from family members, journalists, former members, or researchers easy to dismiss because any source of criticism has already been categorized as part of the corrupt outside world. The framing is self-sealing. The more forcefully someone argues against the group from the outside, the more that argument can be interpreted as evidence that the outside world is exactly as hostile and untrustworthy as the group said it was. Demand for purity. In any high-control environment, there exists an internal standard of belief or behavior that is both clearly defined and impossible to fully achieve. Members are always falling slightly short, always in need of more growth, more commitment, more purification. This is not an accident. A person who feels they have fully arrived has no further need of the group's guidance. A person who believes they are permanently in a state of partial failure remains dependent on the group to define what progress looks like and to validate any improvement. This technique was documented extensively in Lifton's original research and appears consistently across religious movements, totalitarian political systems, and multi-level marketing organizations where there is always a higher rank just out of reach. The demand for purity keeps members striving inward rather than looking outward, and it ensures that any failure to comply can always be attributed to the individual's own inadequacy, rather than any flaw in the system itself. If you want to help, choose the next video topic, join our Telegram, links in the description. Otherwise, click right here to watch Every Black Hole Type Explained in One Video. Next.